Hey guys, you got Cam from Awakenpedia here. Hope we're all doing well. Today we are going to be talking about suicide and specifically on the topic of dissolving suicidal ideation. Now, I want to preface this chat by saying I know this is a vastly sensitive topic and can be quite triggering for so many. So please know that as a disclaimer, this conversation may trigger you. And if you are struggling with suicidal ideation, please seek out resources. They are available to help you now, immediately, and I will provide those in the caption of this video teaching. So, what I'm going to share with you today is an alternative approach and perspective on how to combat and ultimately dissolve suicidal ideation. Suicide is something that plagues this world. It is one of the leading causes of death around the entire globe, particularly for those who are young and old. Um, and largely is going untreated and unaddressed. And when we do try to treat it, it's being treated at the level of symptom rather than the level of cause. So, my efforts here in sharing this teaching are one, to make you realize if you are someone who's struggling with suicidal ideation that you are not alone. Um, it doesn't make you strange, weird, crazy, or different. Um, there are millions and millions of people who are struggling with these same exact thoughts and feelings that you are, and I want to help normalize this conversation by putting it out and open for us to discuss and to um, have a discourse about. So the way this conversation is going to go, um, I've kind of broken it down into a variety of topics. And the first of which is I want to share with you guys the story of my dad who took his life in 2008 during the financial crisis. I want to talk to you about him, his story, and the lessons we can learn through his premature passing by taking his own life. Then I want to talk about the root cause of suicidal ideation and what ultimately leads people to actually attempt to take their own life. And then I want to talk about how we can dissolve suicidal ideation. And I'm going to talk about it in the context of healing, most generally, but also in the context of how I was personally able to dissolve my own suicidal ideation. So let's dive in, and we'll start with my dad. My dad was somebody that was like everybody else, seemingly, in this world. Um, Someone who was, a family man, worked a great job at Morgan Stanley and a variety of other banks as a portfolio manager, managing other people's wealth. He had friendships. He was active in the world and in the community. Um, was a very fun, loving father and also, a very kind, loving husband to my mom. Um, and had such a great heart, was really, truly a wonderful, wonderful person and full of love, truly full of love. Um, at the same time, he was deeply, deeply confused as to who he really was. He was lost. He was confused. My dad believed that he was his mind. He was so confused as to his fundamental, essential identity. Everything was contrived through the mind, and he derived his identity through the world of form, particularly money. As a wealth manager, he was somebody that was very, very focused and perhaps even obsessed with material wealth. His entire identity seemed to be tied up in the stock market, in making money, in trading. And that is who he was. When the market went up, he was happy, loving, kind, the most charismatic person in the world. He was alive, so it seemed. And when the market crashed or went down, was red on the day, he was cold, distant, removed, and unloving. And the swing was all a result of him tying up his identity, his sense of self, with money, with form. And this is something that points to the size of his ego. And remember that the ego is most simply the mind-made sense of self that we construct as some type of imaginary sense of self in our minds that we derive through things in the world or thoughts in our head, and it creates an imaginary mind-made sense of self. That's the ego. The false self, the mini-me, the small self. The ego goes by many names. And my dad's ego was massive because he exclusively identified himself through the mind and through the world of form, the largest piece of form of which was money. And what I mean by exclusively identified with the material world was that there was no sense of connectedness or awareness of what lied beyond what could be perceived with the senses. There was no awareness of being. There was no connectedness to the soul. It was only what he had, what he did, his status, his title, his reputation, his possessions, his net worth, his bank account, right? All of those things were what either augmented and built up who he was when those things were abundant, or took away from his sense of self when they were lacking. So he either felt very full of himself when the materials that he derived his sense of self from were full, or he felt very little and small and lacking of self when those materials were also of lack. This was the foundation on which he knew himself. It was only through materials, only through the world, only through his mind. His conditioned belief of who he was a measure of how much money he made and had. And this is how it is for most people in the world today. Most people only know themselves through the material world, which is a frightening thing because the material world of form is inherently unstable because all form is impermanent. This is really important to realize. Everything of form is temporary. It is transient. It comes and it goes. It never lasts forever. It can't. Form is always changing. It's never permanent, never stable. So when you identify your essential, fundamental sense of self through that which is unstable and impermanent, you yourself become unstable, which is a recipe for disaster. Because, again, as all form must dissolve in time, you're essentially positioning yourself to dissolve in time as well when that form dissolves, which you identified with. Okay? So when you confuse your temporary form identity with your permanent formless identity, you are setting yourself up for disaster, for suffering, and for what can be ultimate catastrophe, as it was for my dad. And to just kind of elaborate on how this played out, leading up to 2008, my dad was one of the most um, happy, elated, seemingly content, and whole and satisfied and fulfilled person that you could think of. And why? Well, the stretch from after the crash of the dot-com bubble in 2001 up into the housing crisis of '08 was a time of great, robust material growth and wealth and prosperity. The markets were doing fantastic. Everybody was happy. Everyone was making money. Everything was going up. Everything was green. And as the market grew, so did my dad's ego. So did his mind-made sense of self that he derived through wealth, through money. And as most know who are aware of what happened during the housing crisis of '08, almost overnight, instantaneously, the housing market collapsed. The house of cards collapsed. And the stock market went down with it. It more or less cut in half overnight. And when that happened, when the stock market collapsed so that it lost 50% of its value, my dad, who derived his sense of self and identity through the stock market, lost half of himself too, overnight. This essentially was what precipitated and led to his suicide and taking his own life, because the massive loss of self, the perceived loss of self, created such a massive identity crisis, it couldn't be tolerated. It was too much to bear. And because there was no connection to anything beyond his material self, the suffering was so intense, he imploded. When you believe that you are your mind and you have no connectedness to that which resides beyond it, you don't know how to stop your suffering. In that moment, his suffering was so intense, and all he wanted was for it to stop. But he didn't know how to make it stop other than to end his physical life. Because he was not aware of that which was beyond the physical world, his only option, so it seemed, to end his suffering was to end his physical life. Yet, that was, as it is for all people who want to end their suffering, an error in perception. Because The death that he sought to end his suffering was one that existed on the level of mind, not on the level of body. The death that he needed to end the suffering was an ego death, as it is the ego as the entity that creates and perpetuates suffering. And this points to the next topic of this conversation that I want to touch on briefly, which is the root cause of suicidal ideation. The root cause of suicidal ideation is being disconnected from spirit. The root cause of suicidal ideation is being disconnected from who you truly are. The root cause of suicidal ideation is the erroneous belief that your essential identity comes from this world and all of the content in it. The root cause of suicidal ideation is the erroneous belief that you are your mind. Suicidal ideation comes about when we have confusion about our identity, when we don't know who we are, when we are so lost in the world, so lost as to what this experience we call life is, so disconnected from the source that enables and empowers all life forms, which is completely beyond the material world that we can see with our eyes and hear with our ears and touch with our hands and smell with our nose and taste with our mouth. It is being disconnected from source, from the source of life, and to know yourself only through the material world of form. And suicidal ideation comes about because when you derive your identity through form, which is of inherent impermanence, you as well feel inherently impermanent and unstable and lost and confused. Something doesn't feel right, and that creates suffering. And sometimes when form collapses, when it's a significant enough collapse, as it was for my dad, like the financial crisis of 2008, when the collapse of form is large enough and severe enough, it can induce an identity crisis that is large enough and severe enough as to urge you to want to take your own life as an attempt to escape from the suffering that you don't know how to stop because you believe you are your mind and because you have no connectedness to that which lies beyond it. It is an exhausting existence to constantly be chasing the material world and to be trying to continuously augment your sense of self and to defend your sense of self through that which you have and do. Those things never last, and so you're constantly remaining in survival mode. And survival mode is exhausting, and it's not where we're supposed to be as human beings. It's not how we're supposed to exist in this world. It is a dysfunctional state of existence in which there is no being and only mind. And when we exist only through the mind in the world of illusions, it must always end in disillusionment, which is the collapse of form, the collapse of the mind-made self. But when there is no connectedness to that sense of self beyond the mind, when the mind-made self collapses, you collapse too. and you don't know where to turn or what to do other than to consider taking your own life because there appears and seems to be no other option. And so that's what my dad did. And that was his fundamental error. And it cost him this incarnation. And my aim with Awakenpedia and the genesis of what birthed this entire platform and spiritual community is to help people realize that they are not their minds so that they don't have to make the same mistake that my dad did. And this is what gets me into the final part of this chat, which is how we actually then dissolve suicidal ideation. How is it possible to be liberated from these urges to end our life, to end the suffering? So let's examine it. The urge to commit suicide and take your own life is the expression made manifest of you saying, I can't live with myself any longer. Think about that expression. I can't live with myself. Who is the I and who is the self that the I can't live with? Are there two of you? Who's the I? Who's the self? One can't live with the other. Which is the real you and which is not? And it is this fundamental expression, which is the essence of the suicidal state, that is the doorway to potential awakening and to shift you out of the suffering that you want to escape from. Because what you come to see is that the self that is struggling, that is suffering, that can't exist and can't be here any longer, that self only exists in your mind. It's not real. It is the ego. It is the egoic, mind-made sense of self. But I'm somebody that also was struggling very deeply in my life for many, many years, perhaps most of my entire existence, as long as I could remember, up until when I began to awaken. I was someone who did not know who I was. I only, like my dad, knew myself through my mind and derived my identity through the material world. I was very focused on what I had, what I did, what I looked like, how much money I made, who I knew, everything in regards to my relationship with the material world. These mind-made identifications that came and went led to significant suffering because I was so confused as to who I was after something that I thought I was disappeared. And so I went through several identity crises, and for a large portion of my life existed in a state of existential depression and confusion and nihilism, in which I experienced severe dissonance between what I did and what I was doing it for. I had no idea why I was doing the things I was doing outside of that people told me I should be doing them, and that those are the things that if I did them well would what make me successful and make me lots of money, and that's what would lead to happiness and a fulfilled life. And yet, the more I leaned into those things, the more successful I became, the more empty I felt, the more disconnected I felt from life itself. I felt soulless, lifeless. And it grew and grew until a point where my ego collapsed because I realized that it couldn't possibly have been real. It was all in my mind. It was all going on inside my head as an interpretation of my life experience. None of it was actually real. It was just simply the way in which I saw it and experienced it as a result of how I saw it. It was my mental interpretation that caused the suffering that made my life so intolerable. It was the attachments I had and formed through my mind, through the egoic mind, that led to the suffering, the vast suffering that I experienced. And through this realization of the false self that I believed to be real, I came back into connectedness with the real me, the true me, the one me. The duality of existence dissolved into oneness so that the false self dissolved, leaving the true self to remain and shine forth. And when this happened, tremendous peace entered, a deep, deep stillness, a wholeness. I no longer felt fragmented or confused or separated. I saw things clearly. I no longer was experiencing the world through my mind as a mental interpretation of what was going on. Instead, I simply saw it as it was. I saw it clearly. And what this really means, and what I'm pointing to here, is that through the ego death, which was the collapse of my mind-made self, that led to the dissolvement of the suffering that made me want to take my own life, because it is the ego as an entity that creates and perpetuates suffering. Without the ego, there can be no suffering, because suffering is a mental interpretation. It is experienced based on your level of consciousness and how you see the world. Suffering is the gap between how things are and how things should be. The gap is suffering. How things should be is your mental interpretation of what is. It is how you want things to be. It is desire. It's the egoic self. How things are is reality. That's what's true. That is absolute reality. It's what is. When the ego dissolves, so that the egoic self up here is no more, suffering dissolves because the gap is removed. Because there no longer is an egoic self. There only is what is. And what this really means then, and the transformative realization of this entire point, is that suicidal ideation dissolves as a side effect of the awakening journey. As you wake up to who you really are, you let go of that which you are not. And it is that which you are not, which is made up through the mind, playing make-believe, that creates your suffering, that makes you not want to be here. It's what makes life intolerable and feel like a burden. When that is removed, life becomes enjoyable. It becomes easy. It becomes a playground, and you just get to play. the pressures and the stresses and all of these mind-made expectations that cause all of the suffering we experience goes away. And you're left with the true self, the one self. You've exited the mind to enter the heart so that you can be. I really fundamentally feel and sense intuitively that spiritual awakening and spiritual connectedness is the missing link in today's efforts to address the suicide crisis that our globe faces. When we examine suicidal ideation in this context that I've described here, we are finally looking at it on the level of cause. We are looking at it at the root cause. And if we can address suicidal ideation at the root, we can heal the infection so that the suicidal ideation, the urges, and the symptoms no longer continue to manifest in various forms throughout life. The world right now is very sick. Suicide, addiction, and the larger mental health crisis have never been a greater threat to our species, and they point to the highly dysfunctional egoic state in which the world predominantly lives in today. If the treatments we were using and deploying in the current efforts to address this were working, we would see a downtrend in the data, not an uptrend that we're seeing today. We would be getting better and healing, not getting worse and more sick. It's time that we wake up and we see what's actually going on here. The way to true health, the way out of suicidal ideation, the way out of addiction, the way out of mental illness, the way out of discontentedness with life itself is to realize who we are beyond the content. To wake up to the formless essence of our fundamental identity. We are not what's being played on the movie. We are the screen on which the movie is played. We're not the foreground. We are the background. We are the observer, the eternal watcher, the perceiver, the looker. Not what's being watched, not what's being perceived, not what's being looked at. Our suffering comes from the result of confusing our identity with the content as opposed to realizing we are that which enables the content to be. When we wake up to realize this, we transmute suffering into peace, chaos into order, insanity into sanity, sickness into health. My mission in this video teaching, as well as the larger efforts and why I created Awakenpedia, is to help people see that they are not their mind, that there is a way out of suffering, and it can be realized here and now through the here and now. Spiritual awakening is what saved my life. It's what could have saved my dad's life, and it's what can save your life too. As we wake up to who we really are, the pure consciousness that enables all objects of consciousness to be, we can relax back into life and play. We can have fun. We can enjoy. We can laugh and love and be. No longer are we so caught up in our minds based on what's going to happen in the future or what happened in the past. We can finally be in the now as we've been designed to be. We can exit from the dysfunctional state that makes us sick and to live in the here and now. I am walking proof of this, as so many others are who have yet to tell their stories. And I want everyone to share their stories, to share their awakening story, to share how spiritual awakening has transformed their lives and has helped them to rise out of suffering and into peace. So just to recap here, okay? And I'll wrap up on this note. The root cause of suicidal ideation is believing that we are our minds, believing that we are the mind-made self that is the ego, and not having any connectedness or awareness to that which lies beyond it. This root cause of suicidal ideation comes from experiencing life from such a shallow place. There's no depth to our being because there's no awareness of being. We are the ripple on the surface of the ocean, and when you only know yourself as the ripple, it is a chaotic, torturous, burdensome experience. You are clashing on the surface against other ripples. You're fighting for territory. You're fighting for survival. It's not a place to live. It's not a way to live. As we wake up, we extend the depths of who we know ourselves to be to include the stillness of the depths of the ocean itself. And through that awareness, through that realization of stillness, of being, comes peace. Now, from that level of consciousness, at that level of existence, we can observe the ripple on the surface of the ocean that's clashing around, and we can see it with compassion. We can see it and maybe even laugh at it. Because it's all play. It's not that serious. The world's not that serious when you realize you're not of the world. It's only when you are convinced that you are of this world and that this world is all there is, and you have this one lifetime to make everything, and there's nothing beyond it. That's when you take this world so seriously. And that's when it becomes a place of suffering and exhaustion, of loss and gain, of sacrifice. It's when you fear death, which is why you do everything you can to prevent it. But sometimes when that is the way in which you live, in that survival state, it becomes so exhausting you would rather just end it, which is why so many people from the burden of life decide to take their lives at that point. And I'm trying to show you guys that there is a way beyond the suffering. You do not have to live in the state of suffering, because you can dissolve the entity that creates the suffering. As we dissolve the ego, the suffering entity dissolves, which is the ego, and suffering dissolves with it, and peace enters instead. And when there's peace, there's joy, and there's interest to live. Life now becomes enjoyable. We want to live, laugh, love, and just enjoy our time here. But the only way to do that is to get out of our minds and into our hearts. So this is an approach and a strategy and a way to help you exit the insanity of your mind so that you can enter the sanity of your heart. All right, guys, thank you for listening. Appreciate you. If you have questions about this and you'd like to talk further on a one-on-one basis in a private, safe space, please feel free to reach out to me. I do offer private services, mentorship services, and this is one of the specialty areas that I focus in. So um, don't hesitate to reach out. I know that this can be a very, very vulnerable, sensitive topic, but know that I've walked this path too. I've walked out of this torturous, suffering state, and I've come into peace, and I can help you to do it too. So um, reach out to me and let's walk this journey together. All right, thank you.